Hello, everyone. This is Lauren Remus. On behalf of America's Job Exchange, thank you for joining us today for From Niche to Now, What's Driving Your DEI Brand. Before we get started, I have just a couple of notes. Please use the chat feature to submit questions at any time during the presentation. We've allowed time at the end of the event to answer your questions. We'll get to as many as time allows, and if we don't get to your question today, you will receive a response via email. And since we get this question a lot, yes, we will be sending a copy of the presentation and a link to the recording to you after the broadcast. Please allow 1 day for that delivery. Finally, after this event, a short survey will pop up. Please tell us what you thought of today's event. Your input helps us shape our programming, so do let us know. And now let's move on to today's presentation. I'd like to welcome Robert Massimilian, Marketing Brand Manager at TMP Worldwide, and our presenter, Jakeda Akbar-Mitchell, Director of Innovation for TMP Labs. Jakeda has many years of experience providing strategic guidance, data, and insights on job seeker trends in support of TMP Worldwide and its customers. As you will hear today, she has a passion for psychology and storytelling, understanding why we do, what we do, and how to change behaviors. Robert, Jakeda, welcome to you both.
Lauren, thank you very much for that. That was a great intro for Jakeda, better than I could have done. So on behalf of the TMP Worldwide team, thanks everybody for attending today. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. So without further ado, I will turn the floor over to Jakeda, who's Director of Innovation for our TMP Labs group, and stay tuned for what is a great presentation. So thanks again, everyone, for participating.
Thank you so much, Lauren and Robert, for that fantastic introduction. And I just want to say thank you also to the participants, to the attendees today. I know that you have extremely busy schedules, so I really do appreciate you making the time for this conversation. As both Robert and Lauren mentioned, my name is Jakeda Akbar-Mitchell. I'm the Director of Insights and Innovation with our Labs group at TMP Worldwide. And so before we jump into this, I just want to start by saying the challenge that you all have in front of you, daily seeking out the best and brightest individuals to not only support your business, but to innovate and to move your company forward, it is a challenging one. It's a difficult, kind of undertaking. And as a part of that conversation, at least for the last 50 or so years, the conversation has also focused around diversity strategy, diversity recruiting as a part of that. But it's often looked like a one-off niche effort or a diversity campaign. But the reality is, based on the changing of our landscape, the kinds of conversations that we're having are moving towards being a bit more nuanced. So we're not looking only at diversity, but around this issue around equity, and also moving into the conversation around inclusion. So it's changed the way that we're talking about, this really immense challenge in front of us, from being a niche effort to being part and parcel with the way that you're structuring your strategy for recruitment today. This is not to say that it's an easy challenge. It's actually quite difficult, because what we're essentially trying to do is change the culture of your organization internally, really expanding it out. And at the same time, the reality is that there's a cultural shift happening in our world that's actually pushing in on your efforts. So a lot of times I hear from our clients, we feel like we're doing all the right things and we're making some traction. And as we see with a lot of the tech companies, it feels like there's a lot of things happening without a lot of movement. And I want to ground this conversation in that notion that what we're doing is hard because what we're doing is actually culture change, while the actual culture of our society is changing and kind of pushing inward on those efforts as well. So I'm going to frame this up into 3 buckets. And it's not because, again, this is easy, but, in a way for us to condense the conversation. One is really understanding the movement, understanding what's underneath the change that's been happening over the past 3 or so years that's moving it from a one-off checkbox to really how we're thinking about equity within a company. Then we're talking about the derived story. And really, when we think about employer brand, when we think about culture, it really is that we're telling a story. We're creating a narrative and a message that we're putting out into the market in order to attract folks in. And for a long time, you all own that story. But the reality is the changing landscape, not just the conversations that folks are having, but the way in which we're consuming information, part of that story is no longer in your hands. And then finally, and kind of to that point, the honest diagnosis is really with this lens towards there's things happening, again, internally within your company while you're trying to expand what that looks like internally, and having a real lens on what that is going to be part and parcel in attracting folks within your company. And so there's this really great quote by Peter Drucker, what gets measured gets managed, and that's exactly right in this instance. If you're not paying attention to all of those forces that are actually impacting your current employees and their experiences, then you don't realize how that story is permeating out and impacting your ability to hire folks in. So we'll start at the very top with the Me Too movement. So to quantify the impact and the effect of this movement, the Me Too hashtag had been used more than 19 million times in the course of 1 year. So it's hard to deny that it's created a bit of an inflection point in the conversation around gender equality. And a lot of that focuses in within the workplace because a lot of the concentration about what was actually happening within the workplace. So it shifted that lens into this space of not just talking about this from the perspective of issues that are happening, but really looking at this holistically. What are our issues with gender equality, with gender discrimination within the workplace as a whole? And so the research shows that 42% of working women say that they've actually experienced gender discrimination within their workplace, with the number one issue being this issue around pay equity. So in fact, 1 in 4 women have said that they've earned less than a man doing the exact same job. They're trying to quantify that. What does that really mean? Well, on average, within the US, women earn 81% of what their male counterparts earned. But because this conversation continues to get nuanced, taking a deeper lens into what does that actually mean when we think about the different types of occupations, plotting that along a grid, what we see is that the top three, the 3 occupations, the top 10 occupations with the greatest pay disparity actually fall within the financial sector. And I bring that up not to make a dig or a ding at the financial sector. I'm sure there's tons of organizations within the sector that are doing really great work in this space. But it's to highlight 2 things. One, the historical impact of culture. So for a really long time, the financial sector was mainly men. And the other piece is to highlight the importance of the perception that's in the market still to this day, that the financial sector is a bit of an all-boys club. And those things are important because, again, you're both coming across this issue of trying to expand out your vision while culture and society is impacting it. And we call those norms, and we call them a whole host of other things, but it's an important part of how we're creating out strategy and thinking about how this is moving into the future. But as always, looking at this on the flip side, because there has to exist, and there does exist, occupations for which there's less pay disparity, where women are actually earning, in pace or sometimes more with what their male counterparts are. And so what actually kind of susses out is that there's less pay disparity in majority female occupations. And it's a curious thing because as we look at that list of occupations that it's lined up on the left, they're in areas such as secretary and administrative assistants, receptionists, maids, and so forth. And so this kind of brought up this interesting question for me. That's a bit of a conundrum, but also highlights the societal impact. Do employers actually place a greater premium and thus a greater value and willingness to pay additional money on roles that we actually as a society gender as female? And so, fortunately, great minds at the Pew Research Center did a really interesting study leveraging AI. They leveraged machine vision technology to understand exactly that challenge. Do we have a propensity to gender-specific occupations? And so they first took a look at the underrepresentation of women in specific occupations leveraging image searches. And they found that there are about 57%, women were underrepresented for about 57% of the jobs. And on the screen right now, you'll see one of just a key example. So for medical record technician, women showed up in images 57% of the time, when in fact they actually occupy 90% of those roles. But they also wanted to see the flip side, that overrepresentation that we were talking about earlier. Do we tend to overrepresent women in specific occupations? And they did find that in areas like maid and flight attendant. But there was this one outlier of this overrepresentation of 42%, which was computer programming, where women showed up in images 34% of the time, they actually occupied 22% of those roles. And so it brings up this really interesting, kind of shift in movement within our spaces as recruiters and advertising for occupations. This understanding that as we move to attract more and more women into areas of STEM, representation matters. Seeing yourself in a role and how companies talk about those roles and the people who occupy those roles within their corporations, that matters to the overarching conversation and how you're developing out your message. But wanting to understand if this is just a US specific phenomenon, because again, we're talking about culture here. And what they found was that this pervasiveness of gendering of roles is actually a global challenge, that it isn't just specific to the US, but it's actually seen, regardless of language and regardless of country as well. So they looked at 15 different countries, or 18 different countries rather, 15 different languages, and what they found was very much similar to what they saw in the US. As an example, a search for nurses, women showed up 84% of the time in Japanese search results and 80% of the time in English language searches in the UK. So the reality is that workplace equity is impacted by our societal norms. It's impacted by the types of jobs, the working patterns, and this last piece is really interesting, the level of seniority. So back in 2012, a couple of the technology companies decided to provide insight into their workforce representation, understanding diversity across gender and also ethnicity. But very quickly, there's this realization that, again, this conversation is nuanced, and it can't just be about overarching diversity. It has to be about who has a seat at the table, who has a voice at the table to make actual change, and who has the opportunity for upward mobility and additional salary attainment. And so when you look at a company like Uber that shows 38% overall diversity, when you slice and dice the data a bit and look at leadership representation and that same number for tech positions, it tells a bit of a different story. So when I say what gets measured gets managed, it's with a lens towards that. And here's the other part of it. While it seems on the face of it as transparency, and partly it is, the reality is that the push for the disclosure of this information, if you will, was pushed by stakeholders and advocates. And I say that because this is going to become slightly important a little bit later, but essentially this conversation, this train that we're on right now will continue to move, and it will continue to get louder and louder. And at this point, companies are having to get on board. It isn't a matter of should we, it's a matter of we're kind of going to be forced to. And it also is one part of what builds the fabric of the narrative of what your D&I story is. While this is disclosure to a job seeker looking to understand who you are, the fact that you are disclosing this information, talking about what you're doing about that challenge within your organization is one piece of information that helps them understand how your company feels about diversity and what they intend to do about it. Big picture, the D&I movement is really being propelled forward by this greater focus on not only inequality, but really understanding that there are biases inherent to systems. And it's definitely going to continue to move that conversation all the way through action. And again, whether companies are on the forefront or on the back front of it, the ones who show up early, who own the narrative, they're going to win out in terms of candidates. And that's even more important in this new landscape when we think about the next generation of workers coming into the fore. So Generation Z is actually poised to be the most diverse generation of our time. And it's important because not only are they the most diverse generation, but they're actually digital natives. They grew up with the internet. And they're underneath that behavior is this continued search for truth and this ability to find that truth, not just in one space or leveraging one avenue, but this realization that they can collect that information and cross-reference leveraging multiple touch points. Much different than in my day where, it was word of mouth, was the person in your school or the person in your home or your Encyclopedia Britannica. They have access to way more information readily at their fingertips than we ever have in the past. And so the first place that job seekers go to find information, honestly, the first place we all go to understand, do research, gain insight, is Google, for better or for worse. And so when we look across our network of 400 plus talent brew sites with over 370 million visitors annually, what we find is that that's pretty consistent. The top source of traffic comes from Google to our clients' career site. And so what's important is that, again, if we stick with the Uber example, if you do a search for diversity at Uber, you leverage Google to do that search and gain information. Google does own the top spot in search results. They show up first, second, third, fourth, and you don't get to something other than a Google site until you hit the fifth search result listing. But on the very side of it, that cultivated story, Google's main goal isn't to support Uber's definition of diversity. It's to provide information and answers to their end users. And they're going to kind of provide that in a whole host of ways. So what you're seeing on the right-hand side of the screen is that there's imagery. And this imagery is coming from a host of different sources that are not Uber. And underneath that, you also have a link to another site that provides its perspective on Uber and diversity as well. Again, Google's trying to provide as much information as possible. And that's not to say that your diversity landing page isn't important. It's actually to highlight the point that it is important, that making sure that you have a destination that's optimized for search results is that much more important, because that's where job seekers are going. And you should be one of those trusted sources as they're weaving together the narrative of who you are. What's your position and your perspective? But not only does Uber have a diversity landing page, they understand that this is a nuanced conversation. And so there is the one diversity page and a whole host of links to 12 other very specific niche diversity pages with this notion of no matter how someone is looking, and this notion of intersectionality. Are you a Black female? Are you a young person from a specific religion? So on and so forth. However I'm searching, whatever my story, my question is, Uber wants to make sure that they're showing up with an answer, with one of the answers to that story as these candidates are weaving together the narrative. But here's the reality of it. Owning the one spot is great. But there are a whole host of other sites that are taking information both from you, exposés, from information that they're gathering from a multitude of places, comparing, contrasting you against your competitors, and they're pushing this content out. We're right now in an environment of content generation, and so understanding what this landscape looks like becomes that much more important. And this is an easy thing to do. You go to Google, you do a search for yourself. But again, it highlights that you're only owning a part of that story. That as candidates are seeking to understand who you are, they're going to go to all of the other sources to make sure that they're making the right decision. This is either their first job or moving from one career to another one. And they want to make sure that it's an experience that is the best, and that they're not leaving one situation for a situation that may not actually move them forward. So in this information age, employers are no longer the sole arbiters of their DEI brand story, and it is just that. Your employer brand is an overarching bucket underneath which your DEI story lives, and it's no longer just in your hands. It's in the hands of anyone who decides to create content. And that becomes important because it isn't just, again, about your landing page. This becomes a matter of how am I telling my story in multiple forms of content? How am I making sure that I have the right type of representation and that I am a part of this conversation as job seekers develop out a narrative about who I am and who we are as a culture? The challenge that comes with this is not only are organizations not the sole arbiter of that information, that as these young people and us in general, as we leverage different tools to access that information, sometimes the tools themselves create biased perspectives. And so a great example, Google has a translation tool, and in translating nurse and doctor from Turkish, which has non-gender pronouns, into English, what was happening was that the translator was translating doctor and nurse, non-gendered pronoun, into he is a doctor and she is a nurse, very specifically. So Google, of course, must have caught wind of this research that was done and very quickly made the adjustment so that it's both she's a doctor, he's a doctor, she's a nurse, he's a nurse. And here's the curious part, and that highlights the point of our society. While they did that in English, if you do that exact same search and you look in Italian and in Spanish, it is still she is a nurse. Again, there's a pervasiveness of how we gender out occupations. And as people seek for the truth, seek to build out that story in multiple places, technology is also creating a distrust. The reality is that biases in our everyday systems erode our confidence so that we can't only use one source of truth anymore. We have to go to multiple places to understand what the actual truth is. And so another one of those spaces where we try to look for the truth, again, an old school method, word of mouth, someone who goes to school with you, your neighbor, and so forth. But now word of mouth is the entire internet. Is anyone who is willing to give a review and their perspective on their experience. And so it used to exist solely with our Glassdoors and our Indeeds of the world. They have their rating scale 1 to 5, and culture was one of those. But that doesn't give a nuanced enough perspective. And so very quickly, we move into this space of niche review sites, where there's a focus on gender-specific reviews. So looking at areas like Fairy Godboss and In Her Site. There's a broader focus on diversity overarching in areas about pay equity, and so you have sites like Comparably that provide that information and specific employee perspectives. But then this last one's really interesting. These kind of rogue outlier fringe sites where there's a ton of information about what's happening within organizations that people can provide anonymously or not. So you have sites like Quora and sites that have popped up like Blind that allow you to provide anonymous perspectives about your experience at an employer, and Fishbowl as well. So I bring up Quora for another reason, and it goes back to this idea of this next generation, Gen Z, and not just this idea that they are the most diverse generation of their time, but they're asking different questions. They're concerned about different things than the generations prior to them. And so doing a search really quickly on Quora for literally diversity at Google, not specific, very general, the very first review that came up was this question: what are Google's employee policies on transgender people? And this was a good review. You know, it gave a good perspective. It provided this really great image of mermaids and additional, characters on the sign. But my point is that not only do you not own the story, that the story is happening in these fringe spaces that you don't have access to, or that you're not necessarily paying attention to, but making sure that you're aware of all of the spaces, the types of conversation, and how you need to position your messaging and understanding your culture is that much more important. So looking at those top 3 sites that are designated spaces for these specific conversations, so Fairy Godboss from a gender perspective, In Her Site, and so forth, what I found was that year over year, the annual traffic growth was over 100% for each one of these sites. And that, Indeed Media, was actually the top source of traffic to each one of these sites. So job seekers were going to Indeed, seeing jobs, understanding a company's review, and then going on to these other sites to understand a more nuanced perspective based on their interest. And so Indeed actually ranked #1 last year for pretty much all of these sites. What's interesting is that very last one, Comparably, which does focus on diversity broadly speaking. But what you find is that in addition to Indeed, there's also traffic from Fairy Godboss. So as we think about intersectionality and how folks are collecting information from different sites, this highlights that exact point, that they're not looking for one source of truth, but they're actually going to weave together that story, both from the perspective of a diverse candidate, racially, culturally, ethnically, but also from the perspective of gender as well. But it was a little bit of a curious data point for us because, I mean, I honestly sit in the data very often, just really understanding how candidates are moving through sites and coming to our clients' sites. And so that huge jump of 100% seemed like a lot. And so, kind of digging in, understanding that Indeed actually made the interesting choice of partnering with all three of these sites. So in addition to your Indeed rating, you also have a rating from all three of these, Fairy Godboss, In Her Site, and Comparably, understanding that candidates don't only want to know how your employees perceive you, generally speaking, but trying to provide a more nuanced insight. But again, this highlights the point that even though they see a 3.9 on Indeed, that isn't enough information. And even though they see a 4.0 on Indeed for Comparably, they're still clicking on the link and trafficking through to those sites because what they're looking for are those individual reviews, those individual employee voices that speak to the experience that they're having within your company. So this is the derived story, the story that isn't just in your hand, that you're not the sole arbiter of. Candidates are weaving together a narrative, your DEI narrative, across multiple engagement points, both seen and unseen, both in designated spaces and in the fringes. And so understanding and being able to audit that space, not just your site and how you're developing out your landing pages and so forth, but really understanding how that message is being woven across multiple touch points is important to moving your strategy forward. And here's where I tell you there's no silver bullet. And usually I say this up front, but I'm going to say it here now before we move into really taking a closer look of internally within your organization. And here's why. I started off this conversation with this one key point, that culture is shifting externally, and it's pushing in on your efforts to expand the culture and to shape and shift and move the culture within your organization. And culture is a specific thing. The culture in your company is different than the culture in your competitor's company, and it's the reason why a candidate probably chose you, besides it being a great opportunity, over your competitor. And so this idea that there is one silver bullet that's going to solve this challenge across the board for all companies doesn't actually exist. It's us continuing to have this conversation and understanding what if this makes sense for our company, and what if this makes sense for the type of culture that we're trying to cultivate within our organizations. So kind of boiling this down into three salient things. One, truths. So there is systemic barriers, and these are creating blind spots within your organization, and that's a reality that we need to focus in on. The second is perceptions. And so, as I mentioned earlier about weaving that narrative across multiple touch points, knowing your DEI footprint is part and parcel with being able to put together a content strategy, a media strategy that's actually going to have an impact. Because otherwise, you're developing media strategies, driving traffic into the top of your funnel, and the bottom of your funnel that doesn't even exist in the funnel, but what's actually your organization is pushing up against those efforts, and that's where the friction is happening. And then finally, motivations. And so it's really about speaking with candidates and not speaking at them. So this is about assumptions, and we often make them, and that's rooted in our norms and our biases and so forth, but it's moving to this space where we're moving past assumptions of someone because of their gender and so forth, and really understanding what their motivational needs are. So thinking about this piece about truth. So here's where we talk about all the things that are hard, and I think this is really one of the biggest challenges for clients today, is this audit piece, auditing pay, auditing practices, and really being honest about what aspects are creating blockages to promotions and are not creating pathways to upward mobility for specific candidates. And so being able to understand the root causes of those challenges is important. Your culture is tied to the experience of your people, and your people are your talent influencers. They're the ones, whether they stay or they leave, that are leaving reviews on sites. And so being able to make sure that you know where those blockages are, that you're very visible with how you're trying to approach and address those blockages is important to the experience that your people are having and plays a part into the types of reviews that they're leaving. Oftentimes clients say, oh, well, if we could just get more people to leave reviews. You can, but the reality is that if you have a challenge within your system, more reviews is not going to solve that because folks are having conversations now in fringe spaces. And so the final piece is being transparent about those challenges and developing that narrative from the front rather than trying to build it after the case. Your recruiters are essentially making the case for your organization with a diverse pool of candidates when they should have an easier time if you're creating the conversation and being honest about the narrative. So the market has responded over the past 5 or so years, and this space of technology within to kind of address these challenges around diversity has actually grown over that course of time. And it's in multiple spaces: talent acquisition, engagement or retention, and so forth. The area that I think has the most promise and probably has the least likelihood to be in the news for issues around biases is really this issue of analytics. And I actually think it's the most important because it really is about understanding what's happening at the core of your organization. 64% of the D&I analytics market focuses in on analysis and monitoring, that very specific subcategory. So understanding issues around retention, developing out KPIs, enabling, analysis of pay equity, assessing network and inclusions, how are people understanding how they move up in your organization, and finally translating that into not only dashboards, but solutions. How do we tie that all together and understand what we can do to address some of these systemic issues that we're finding? And there's a whole host of vendors in this space. One that I find really interesting really focuses in on not only providing an employee voice, but also because there's a lot of conversation happening around HR and HR's ability to kind of triage challenges that they hear within organizations, whether or not people are actually being heard and what's being done about that. Vendors that kind of address that issue. How do we give more visibility to our internal folks in terms of what's happening when an instance is reported is that much more important, feeling like you're being heard. And as I'm sure you're all aware, legislation was passed to provide additional information around not just race and gender for employees on specific categories, but really breaking that down into 12 different pay ranges. And there was a bit of fight, and this was supposed to happen a few years back, change of administrations and holdups. But we finally got to the point where companies that have 100+ employees have to provide that information to the EEOC. And so what used to look like one line for one category along different races and ethnicities is now that specific category aligned with those races and ethnicities broken down by all 12 pay categories to provide additional insight into where those challenges are happening. Now, remember, earlier I said, you're either going to be at the front of this or you're going to be forced to move into that space, whether it's shareholders or advocates and so forth. More and more as this conversation continues to get louder, employees' hands are going to have to be tipped into that space. So it's a matter of owning the narrative on the front end or having to come up with the narrative after the case. And I bring that up because, interestingly enough, in the UK, they started this process in 2017. And so right now, a publicly available website, you can search for an employer, and you can essentially pull back information around their gender pay analysis for every single employer. And so, while this is not happening in the U.S. currently, this isn't a push to disclose that information that the EEOC is collecting. The point here is that once the information is collected, moving from information that's collected to someone pushing on that information being disclosed in a very real way, it's easy to see how that leap can be made. The second is perceptions. So understanding what your DEI footprint is. And this really is about auditing review sites, staying ahead of the conversation that might be negatively impacting your perception. And really, it isn't, kind of counteracting and not telling the truth. It actually kind of goes hand in hand with this idea of understanding what's happening in your organization. Maybe there isn't a space for that incident to be triaged through, and how you're learning about that is through these spaces. Regardless, this becomes an important a space to understand what's happening in your organization. And then understanding your representation. When I showed that screenshot of a search for Uber diversity, what you saw in that top upper left, upper right-hand box was images. And that goes, again, to this notion of representation and how much that matters and how you're representing yourself in your specific occupations. And so we did I wanted to do an interesting kind of search. It's very similar to the Pew Research study for one of our clients, and this is Fidelity. Fidelity did a lot of really amazing work alongside us as TMP, their partners, to really move the needle on their financial consultant role, understanding that this is one of those areas where they had an imbalance in gender, and they were actually trying to hire on more females within this role. They did the hard work. They understood their internal systems. They did research. We did research with them to understand the perception, the motivation, and then activate that out from a content perspective, from the destination page on their career site, and so forth. And so I did a quick search for a specific role. For that role aligned with Fidelity. And what I found was that there was an interesting balance of females across all the different content types. Because what Fidelity is trying to do is own or be a part of that conversation from a content perspective. And we used to just have that conversation about social. How are you being a part of the conversation on social? It's moved past that point, and Google's shifted us past that point in the way that they continue to evolve their search algorithms. So not only should you look for diversity aligned with your company, broadly speaking, but if there are specific occupations that you may not be 100% sure are gendering or what the balance is there, this is a really quick diagnostic, simple to understand what that looks like. And if folks are searching for that opportunity, are you being a part of that conversation, and how are you representing that role? And finally, that brings us to motivations, because it isn't just about the visual story. It really is thinking beyond things like females in our organization are looking to have children, so do we have work-life balance in maternity? Here's the reality. You're hiring women in all segments of their career evolution, and that may not be on the mind of a younger woman coming into your organization. So not making the assumption that that's the most important aspect, but really taking a more nuanced lens and understanding what's actually important to that candidate becomes important in terms of developing out the right kind of content and messaging, both from the perspective of the destination on your site, but also as you build out content across different spaces. So this is about speaking authentically, discarding that one-size-fits-all approach and really digging into that, because, again, we are trying to build out this multi-channel, robust content strategy. And then finally, it isn't just about pushing that information out into the world. This isn't a conversion strategy. This is a long game. And understanding the key performance indicators that are aligned with the channel and the intent is important. Because you put out one article about an experience of females within your organization, doesn't mean that that's going to necessarily mean that you have a boost in applications for the role. But it does look like you're moving the needle and you're building out your story for those candidates that are looking for that information. And so understanding the point and the impact of that specific area. So this really goes to the heart of one of the things that we've been doing at TMP over the past year and a half, 2 years. And it really is taking this approach as we think about how we build out not just our employers, not just our clients' brand and their employer brand story, but really taking this laser-focused approach on the individual employees that they're trying to have a conversation with. Long ago, personas looked like a specific person in age, they probably read X, Y, and Z magazine. And so again, a lot of assumptions. And so instead of doing that, a more nuanced approach, really digging into the research of what motivates that person, what kind of challenges they have in terms of accepting this position, kind of really building out context around what they're looking for. So in this instance, it looks like our branded CX offering. And so essentially, it's really thinking about the candidate experience and how we're designing out that experience, but focused in on that persona, not from a broad brush approach, but understanding the motivational challenges, building out an entire storyboard, if you will, on that candidate, on their experiences, on their needs, building that into an entire map of the types of content, the types of spaces, the channels, and then ultimately KPIs for each one of those channels, and again, understanding the intent. So the point isn't just to say we're doing things. That again is the old school approach. That's checking off a box. It's really understanding that the things that you're doing have an impact, what that impact is, and how can we quantify that over time to show that we're actually making some changes from year to year. Right now we're in a moment, and I know that I talked about young folks and how they seek information, but here's the reality. It isn't just about this next generation, Gen Z. 67% of job seekers say that a diverse workforce is an important factor when evaluating companies and job offers. And that evaluation piece is important here, because again, this goes whole heart into evaluation isn't about, yes, I want you. It's about, I'm going to decide that I don't want to be a part of this organization because it doesn't align with my values. And that isn't just your diverse candidates that are coming into your organization. That's every candidate that comes into your organization is looking for something that goes beyond just one size fits all, that goes beyond just their perspective. They're looking for a diversity of perspectives. So the honest diagnosis is really understanding that hiring talent is impacted by the experiences of your current workforce. If your current workforce is having challenges, if they're not being heard, then they're going to find a place to have that voice somewhere else that you may not realize. So understanding the impact of that, how those stories are impacting your ability to hire on, is important to the overarching strategy. That is everything from me. I will turn it over to Lauren to take questions.
Thank you, Jacada. And if anyone does have a question, please submit it through the chat function, and we will get to your questions. Jacada, while we're waiting for a couple of questions to come in, something that struck me, we are often faced with hiring targets based on affirmative action plans. And what, the challenge can be creating those narratives for specific demographics, say, for example, veterans, when we're trying to hire there. Are you sort of seeing your clients creating these same sort of programs that reach out in these ways into niche sites for veterans, say, for example?
That's a great question. And I think that while the niche sites are still a part of that conversation, so two things. One, it is this laser focused in on that one specific audience, but again, to the idea of the branded CX, it's understanding what's actually a motivational factor for that audience and not making the assumption. But as a part of that overarching strategy, as we think about the channel strategy, niche sites are a part of it, but it isn't the only part, because we realize that everyone is looking for jobs on Indeed and everyone is on social. And so how do we tell that story in a multitude of ways, not just one site, but on multiple sites, and understanding whether or not one channel is meant for direct conversion, one channel is meant for brand engagement and how we build out that perspective, and knowing that each one of those things is kind of seeding the conversation and moving it forward.
Great. So we had a question around recommendations on how to start DEI programs beyond auditing facts and perceptions.
Sure. So a lot of clients, and this is a double-edged sword. So a lot of clients will start from the perspective of understanding, kind of where those challenges are, and it looks like internal resource groups. If you have current internal resource groups right now, really tapping into those groups and understanding where they see the challenges are, that's a great way to start to build out your program. I think oftentimes it's a laundry list. So we have, resource groups for this group, that group, this group, that group, and it looks good when you list them all out, but that's a really great wealth of information and a source of understanding what needs to happen next. So really tapping into those groups and building out programs based on that foundation is a really great way to start. Most companies, I believe, have, employee resource groups built in, and the way that those are evolving over time is that those are being tied into retention goals and then also overarching business goals.
Okay, and as a follow-on to that, once you sort of have that, kind of look at your organization, how do you tie it into a more holistic approach to D&I as opposed to a goal of solely looking at numbers like affirmative action stats or these different groups?
Sure. I think in general, in terms of how companies are reevaluating that approach, not just to D&I, but to culture. So again, this is a cultural shift. It's understanding that there's a relationship that's that used to be a more defined line, but it's almost evaporating between what we think of external and what we think of internal. So really getting into a room with your internal communications team and making that a holistic strategy where you're understanding what you're trying to do and what's happening within your organization. I'd say that that's kind of one very foundational approach. The other one is, and I didn't necessarily call this out specifically, but the fidelity example is a really good one, because I think a lot of companies try to do kind of a whole host approach, like let's move the entire ship in a completely different direction, and that's really hard to do. And what Fidelity did was understanding, while we use the term always on, understanding while they need to approach this from an overarching diversity perspective, is there one area that they can start with, that they can pilot in a more salient way, that they can move the needle with, and develop out a strategy that they can then scale to other groups? So sometimes it's hard to look at the entire picture and think about how we move the entire thing. But if you know that there's a key, area within your organization that you can make a change on, you can see actual results with, start there. While you're doing your whole host approach, go from a more piloted perspective in order to start to move the needle, and then figure out what works internally for your culture and your organization.
And we had another question just around looking back at those different diversity groups within an organization. There's a perception at this company, and our questioner does not agree, that these groups create more division. Do you have any information that would support, kind of that once we have that whole look, filtering it back down into the organization in a way that's cohesive?
Sure. So that's one that I find really fascinating. And I can't remember the exact organization, but there was a company about 3 years ago that decided to dismantle all of the ERG groups, decided to get rid of them. That's not what we need. We need, everyone to be at the table at the same time. And I was waiting to see if all companies were going to follow suit, and they didn't. The reality is that what we've seen by and large is that the employee resource groups are important, but having different voices in those groups, and it may not look like the majority folks who are in those groups, but having different voices within those groups is also important. And making it more salient than just you're getting together, right? It isn't just a getting together, it's understanding what the conversations are, and do those conversations roll up to actions that we can change. And so I agree with whoever the questioner is. I don't think that they create more division. I think that they're not structured in the way that they can have the greatest amount of value.
Well, that answers all of our questions. So I'd like to say thank you on behalf of America's Job Exchange. Thank you, Robert and Jacada, and our partner, TMP Worldwide, for today's presentation. And thanks to all of you for attending. We hope to have you join us again in the future. This concludes our broadcast, so have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.